world of business, there's a brand new way.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor, and today I will be having a conversation with Patrick Griffin. Now, I haven't met Patrick personally myself, but we were introduced by a mutual friend, and I've been following him for a while on LinkedIn. He has a great profile. He's a very humble person. His background shows that he has amassed over $1 billion in negotiated deals. So I'm really looking forward to getting into the rough with Patrick and learning a few tips about his trade and how he negotiates and what he's doing today to share his information and make an impact. Thanks very much, and look forward to catching you on this episode of Empathy at the Table. Hello and welcome to Patrick Griffin. Thank you very much for joining us today on Empathy at the Table.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Tony. Thank you for having me.
Patrick, so I've been following you for a while, and we were introduced to each other by a mutual friend, Mike Inman. And one thing that I've noticed, just the research I've done, is you really come across as a very kind of humble person who's had a lot of great experience, but you seem now in the phase of your life where you want to really give back. You want to make an impact. Would you like to share how close to the mark that is, and a bit about yourself to our audience?
Sure. Well, that's a lovely observation, and I hope it's true. I've certainly had periods in my life where I was less humble, and I find that the older I get, like many people, the more I realize how much I still have to learn, and frankly, also how much I enjoy that process of learning. And for me, part of that process of learning is sharing with it and growing with other people. That's an incredible vehicle for me. I feel very fortunate to be able to engage with people that way, teach people and learn at the same time. And in terms of giving back, yes, that's a big part of how I was raised and how I like to live. So I've been involved with community organizations for most of my career. I've been in leadership positions with a few cultural institutions in my community now. I'm currently setting up an arrangement with my local kind of chamber of commerce to help local entrepreneurs as they grow and scale their businesses. So finding ways to take what I've been able to learn and help propagate that out among people who would benefit, and really helping drive growth at a community level is something I think everybody should be doing. And I'm very happy that I was raised that way.
Fantastic. What a great introduction. Let's go back a bit. So you, just for our listeners, you are very humble. So you haven't mentioned the fact that you cut your teeth in the bond selling business, and you've negotiated over $1 billion worth of deals in your lifetime. Now, were you always Patrick that we see today, the giver, or were you a different kind of character when you were in the financial industry?
Oh, so I wonder. That's interesting. I think there's always been an element of my character that was a giver. And I think there are absolutely times in my life where I've been more selfish and perhaps a better term for that, a little more ambitious. And so, yes, I did. I spent 10 years on Wall Street, mostly in the bond industry, doing some pricing strategy, sales, negotiation, a bit of product development. And I really loved that, as you said, and that's how I phrase it. I cut my teeth in that space. I learned a tremendous amount, and I really, really loved it. And then I made a career pivot for family reasons, moved into banking in a smaller community in central New York. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've lived there. I've spent about 5 years of that in banking. And I definitely have become more humble in that time as I've just experienced challenges of one type or another. I think I probably had a long stretch of luck as a cis, white man in America, where it's pretty easy to get along a lot of the time. And so I've had some challenges, and they've really helped me learn. And frankly, I've had a couple of difficult years that were really profoundly challenging. And I'm so happy that I had them, because I know I came out of them the best version of myself I've ever been. And so it, one of those things, it's a classic story, but difficult when you're there, and you change with it, your life changes, but hopefully you use that to become a better person. And I think I did.
Yeah. I know what you mean. My father passed away 2 years ago, and
Mm.
it was the most difficult, most challenging time of my life. But it also, in some ways, it was actually the coming out, right? I learned so much about myself that I didn't really know, and others learned much about me as well. So these kind of challenges, what kind of challenges would you say have been the ones that have been the most ones that have been most revealing for you, but not just for you, but for the people around you?
So I think part of it was really a confluence of challenges all at the same time. So going into the COVID period, I
Mm,
had finished a graduate degree. The bank I was with had some redundancies, so there was a reduction of workforce. I was initially part of that, and then I was asked to stay on for a year. So what that really introduced was just a degree of career instability. When prior to that, I had been very uh, I benefited from substantial career stability prior to that. So
mm,
I was in New York for 10 years. I had been in this role for 5 years. I had only had two roles in my professional career. And then there was an element of doubt injected in that, which doesn't sound like a big, profound challenge for anybody. But at the same time, dealing with COVID, we've got three small children at home, and trying to figure out what to do with this new degree that I had earned. And so I should add that up until recently, I was the sole breadwinner for the family. My wife just returned to working outside of the home for the first time in 10 years about a month ago. And so, as the sole breadwinner, having that uncertainty at the career level introduced was a challenge. And then making sure that I could help children who were young. So when COVID started, my children were 6, 4, and like 1 year old. And
wow.
so bringing those children through that period
Wow.
with my wife and trying to keep them up socially and academically. Now, academically, she handled most of that, but just you know, many folks had challenges during COVID. My challenges were probably minor relative to almost everybody's, but it was a new experience for me, and it introduced some challenges to doubt. Another big
Mm,
one that was really impactful on my career that's worth mentioning is so we had moved from Brooklyn in New York to outside of Syracuse, New York, which is a smaller community, still a city, but a much smaller city, and culturally very, very different. So I grew up outside of New York City, spent most of my career at that time in New York City. And then moving to outside Syracuse was a real cultural adjustment for me, particularly professionally. So socially, it wasn't a big cultural adjustment, but I had come from, fairly braggadocious Wall Street culture, and moving into a community banking role and going from working with global financial institutions, which had been my customer base in New York, moving to working with really startup through middle market companies. So pre-revenue companies up to the largest maybe did $30 million a year. Very, very different customer profile. And so learning how to communicate differently, communicate in a way that was appropriate
mm,
here, but also still allowed me to be successful and demonstrate my competencies, was a real learning curve for me,
mm.
and helpful. And so now I try to balance those things. I've always tried to be able to communicate with people where they are and connect with them at the way that they like to communicate. But that was a real learning
Yeah.
exercise for me.
I mean, what's definitely coming across here is the level of emotional intelligence that you possess. I mean, we started off. I don't know whether it was off camera or on camera, but you said your family have been in New York since, was it the 1800s, 1876? Or did you say right?
1842. I have family that
1842.
yeah, moved to Williamsburg in 1842. I found a written account of it
Wow.
a number of years ago at my cousin's house. It was enlightening.
Wow. So when you think about that and you think about your family's history and then what you're doing today, how do you think your environment you were brought up in has shaped the way you see yourself as a negotiator today?
I think a lot about this, Tony, and so thank you for asking that. My father is a retired attorney. Many of the members of my family on that side have been either attorneys or judges, so in the legal space. And so the art of rhetoric, speech and argumentation were always really prized in my house. On the other side, there's more of a mixture of expertise, but my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, and father of 9, of which my mother is the oldest. So big family, and again, a mixture of expertise. But I tend to think of where I've landed as a nice mixture of those two areas. So I've always been entrepreneurial, even when I was within a large corporate structure. When I was with Moody's Investor Service in New York, I wound up coming up with a new product that the market seemed to need, and nobody had created a new product there in memory. And so it took about 3 years. We had to step back and figure out, okay, we have 100 regulators just in the US alone. Who needs to approve this internally, externally? What does this look like? And so that was my first experience with, people call it an intrapreneur or corporate entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And that really lit a new fire in me for creating something myself. And so that at this point was probably 8 years ago that we launched that. But it was really helpful for me as a way for me to connect to that side of my family that is has been creative in the corporate space, or in the commercial space, I should say. And so I should also mention that I went to a high school that was really focused on a variety of skills. It was a fairly traditional education. It is a small international high school on Long Island in New York called the Stony Brook School, that exposed me to a variety of cultures. It allowed me to go to Asia twice when I was a teenager, which was extraordinary. And they really focused on speaking and argumentation skills as well as sciences. So a really wonderful mixture of liberal arts and sciences that gave me a tremendous bedrock to understand how I learn, and to allow me to build off of that. So this is a roundabout way to answer your question, Tony, but I'm very proud of the entire family that I come from, both my father's and my mother's side, and I really seek to honor them. I was speaking with my mother recently so her father died about 30 years ago, and I was young at the time. I was 13 maybe. And I knew him, of course, but I didn't know him as well as I would have if I had been able to become an adult while he was still around.
Sure.
And what I'm working on now and really trying to build, I just felt convicted in speaking with my mother that that's something I think he would have been proud of. And I really do think that. So it's wonderful for me to come from a culture where I feel a connection to the past generations, and also feel like I'm doing them service.
Wow. I'm blown away, Patrick. I must admit, I didn't expect this level of depth. This is fantastic. And the reason it's important to me is because I'm really interested and passionate about changing the narrative people have when it comes to negotiation. And a lot of your work is based around that as well, in terms of trying to help people see that negotiation is not an adversarial pursuit. It's actually, you called it in one of your interviews, a creative conversation, right? Where you're working with your counterpart to come up with creative solutions. And there's one thing that I love that you do in your workshops, and I'll ask you to elaborate on this, is you said you get people together and you give them the debrief or the brief, and then you have them negotiate, and then you see how they're sat, and then you make some adjustments based on your concept. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Oh, I do love this. This is a bit of a trick. It's a gimmick, but I love it. So invariably, and this is largely because of people's perception of negotiation from media, when people sit down to negotiate a mock scenario, they will sit opposite sides of the table from one another. And it's very natural. But after 5 minutes or so, I make them get up and I have them sit on the same side of the table. And the reason I do that is to try to reorient their thinking. Ultimately, when parties get together to negotiate, ultimately what they are trying to do is solve the same problem together. And I, in our society, competition is lauded, but in science, especially in wildlife science, animal science, we recognize that cooperation is a true marker of intelligence rather than competition. And so I've written about this before, but when we compare the relative intellect of animals, which is a difficult thing to measure, we find that cooperation goes along with intelligence more often than competition, which comes naturally,
Mm.
but is just less likely to aid in propagating that species. And so, one of the things I like to do is try to dispel misconceptions about negotiation and reorient folks to understand that it is a creative exercise, as you said,
Right.
that it can be a cooperative exercise, and ultimately, when done well, in the negotiation parlance, it's about growing the pie, or the
Right.
expanding pie, but building something together to identify core competencies that allow us to each get past where we were before, and
Yeah. Yeah.
to build on that. And I'm a huge believer in that. I love competition. I've always been an athlete, but when cooperation works, it is absolutely world changing.
Let's talk about that, because this comes up so much. The subtle, nuanced relationship between competition and collaboration, right? I think oftentimes people think it's one or the other. It's binary, right? But actually, what I'm hearing, and certainly my experience, is why don't we compete to see how we can get the best outcome for us both, right? Instead of competing against each other. So, what you're saying is let's not take competition out of that, because that, brings out the best in us. But it's how we compete and what we're competing for, right? So how it's all very well you and I talking about this, but in your experience, when you were doing these multi-million dollar deals, and you're dealing with people who might have a slightly myopic view on how to win a deal, how were you able to steer the conversation from being strictly competitive to being more competitive and collaborative at the same time?
So I have this might be a bit of a tangential answer, but I promise I'll keep it brief.
Yeah, go
So
for it. Go for it.
my undergraduate education is a little bit unconventional. I love to learn about everything. I studied a variety of things in undergraduate school, and I ultimately wound up with a, degree in business management with a concentration in finance, but a minor in British literature, because I was always engaged with literature. I've been a writer for most of my life. I've always been a reader, and um, I think that when you're negotiating with a counterparty that really embraces that zero sum mentality,
Yeah.
a lot of it can come down to storytelling. So we as humans like to build narratives around what we're doing, where we are in our lives, what we expect our lives to look like. And so that can be redeployed in a way to paint a picture for the counterparty and say, well, let's go through a thought exercise here. Let's say we do it this way. What is
Mm.
this going to look like down the line? Where are we going to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? Whereas, what's it going to do if we take this approach that's really grinding down the edges for everybody? So it's an exercise in trying to position the story in a compelling way that opens their eyes to what it could be.
Mm.
And that, which is not to say I'm up there giving monologues, but a lot of that can be excuse me, a lot of that can be achieved through asking really calibrated, open-ended and closed-ended questions as well, to
Yeah.
kind of lead
Yeah.
them along. But ultimately what you're trying to do is take them through a potential series of events in their heads that really looks like a narrative, or can look like a narrative.
Mm. What are some things that you have done in a negotiation where you think, oh, damn, I should never have done that. I wish I hadn't said that.
I have one that I cannot possibly get out of my head, which is good, but it was brutally embarrassing at the time. And
Yeah.
this was fairly early in my career, but I had a counterpart that was frankly a bully, and he was much more senior than I was in the industry. He was a talking head on financial news shows sometimes, and but he was also, and this was unusual, the industry in which I worked in the bond rating space was large in terms of dollars. It was fairly small in terms of individuals. So I found myself working with the same people a lot of the time. This was a new
Mm.
contact for me. He was working with an asset type that I knew, but he was a new customer of mine, or intermediary in this case. And he pulled every trick out of the book out of how to negotiate as a bully. issued ad hominem attacks, he tried to appeal to fairness in ways that were incredibly disingenuous. And being younger in my career and less experienced with that, I took the bait. And I started getting more emotional. I started becoming less rational. I fed the trolls, as some might say. And I wound up, the real consequence of that was that I lost some face with my leadership temporarily. Now, I'm proud to say that I knew the details of the space of the industry and what should and could be achieved commercially well enough that I actually got exactly the outcome that I wanted in that negotiation, which is really more about how I'm data driven than anything. From a negotiation perspective, it was an abject failure, but I'm a fairly analytical person, and so I was able to make it work in the end. But I did lose some face, and I learned a hard lesson about how not to get drawn into those emotional entanglements that are just not productive. And so that's something that, I tend to think of myself as as I said, analytical, fairly rational person, but we are all at some point sensitive to those types of attacks. And it takes some practice and some discipline to learn how to not be drawn into that.
Yeah. I mean, I saw like a video maybe a couple of years ago of Mike Tyson and, training again. And he looks so fit and, he's almost 60. And I thought, well, if he can do it, maybe I should give it a shot. So I started watching all these YouTube videos on how to box. And I've never boxed before, but I like contact sports. And so I was watching these videos and how he does his hooks and his uppercuts and everything. And I was practicing at home. Then I escalated to the gym and I started doing the pads. And then I, went on a sack and I just thought, wow, this is just great. And then I decided to go in the ring and I lasted 42 seconds in the ring. And here's the funny thing was my opponent didn't even hit me. He was just jabbing and I was trying to dodge and it just, and my reflection on that is, you can read about negotiation, you can study it, you can talk about it, but when you're actually in the moment and those emotions just trigger you and take over, there's no substitute for actually doing it in real time, right? Doing it in real life and really practicing. So how do you in your trainings, how do you prepare people for real life negotiations?
So that's something that that I had less focus on when I was really teaching through COVID and doing more remote education, because I couldn't figure out how to do that well. And it's still something. So one of the hallmarks of my training and negotiation is that I've never given the same seminar twice for two main reasons. One, I'm always really mindful of how I can improve it as I'm going through it. And I really try to solicit feedback to make things better. And two, I do my best to customize my training to the industry or the practice, the discipline of the people that I'm teaching. So if I'm teaching a CPA firm how to negotiate, that's going to look a little bit differently than I'm teaching a mixture of executives from the manufacturing space. Right. And those are real examples. Those are different groups of people that I've taught.
Right.
And so one of the things that I continually try to do better is find a way to engage with that kind of repetitive learning. And I don't know that I've cracked the code on it yet. I do put participants through case studies, mock scenarios. I have them, read little précis and come back and negotiate. But most of the time in the trainings that I'm able to give, we get to go through maybe one of those. And that's absolutely beneficial. But it's not the same as high volume repetition. One thing I'm interested in, I believe it's Philip Brown who does the negotiation flashcards. And I haven't played with those. And Philip, if I got your last name wrong, I apologize. But
it's Phil Brown. Yeah,
thank you.
Guy.
Thank you.
Great guy. Yeah.
Great guy. And I have not. I've seen his flashcards in practice, but I haven't used them. I haven't deployed them yet. And I'm really interested to see what that looks like, because I know he's really focused on that practice aspect of it, which I think is important. So that is going to be. I'm going to test that out a little bit. The short version is that's something that I always try to do. At least a little bit of, but I think that doing it at scale and at volume is really beneficial. And that's an open question to me about the best way to do that. And so I'm iterating it to determine how to really tackle that problem, because it is quite important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're really dedicated to your trade. I like the fact that you are continually iterating. Sometimes, especially when it comes to teaching negotiation from an academic standpoint, it's the same material being regurgitated over and over again. And I have a challenge with that. I think that it's important to have the frameworks, but then when it comes to practice, the fact that you say you've never given the same workshop twice, that puts you in a position of ultimate kind of power over people who are just regurgitating the same information. And I think that's a testimony to you and your commitment to your trade. I have one comment for you. I was going to say this at the top of the conversation, but I just want to kind of ask you this now that we've got to know each other a bit better, right? So I used to have a friend working in finance back in the 80s, in the days of, Gordon Gekko, greed is good, all that kind of stuff. And I remember he said to me, the house always wins. If the broker wins and the client wins, then that's a black swan event. Normally, it's either the house will always win. It's normally either the broker or the client. And typically it's the broker. With that kind of mentality, that was rife in the 80s. You were trading around that time, right? I suppose with that in that era of greed is good type mentality.
So one challenge I have is that my beard is completely white, and I might look a little bit older than I am. So a couple things. I was never a trader.
For the listeners who are listening on Spotify or on Apple, I would hazard a guess that Patrick looks to me to be between 38 and 42.
Okay, so thank you. So I'm just outside of that. I am 43. But I was also never a trader. So I worked with bond ratings. So my job was to maintain relationships and sell my company's opinions on the relative riskiness of securities. So bonds and securitizations, things like that. And so I think I came in probably towards the end of the greed is good period, partly because I started my career on Wall Street about 18 months before the downturn in 2008. And so I worked with those people. Certainly I was managed and led by those people. Right. But I should also mention that I was attracted to finance for a variety of reasons. I love math. I love analysis. I like money a little bit because it affords me the opportunity to engage in other hobbies and learn about other things. But despite spending 10, 15 years in financial services, I never associated with, or socially, I never engaged with other finance people. I just wasn't drawn to them. Oh. And so my friends historically have been artists and musicians. In New York, our friend group was primarily people in the arts. And it's funny. I'm able to keep both of those things in my head and in my hands at the same time. I love what I do, and I love to work that way in those industries. But in my private life, the people I'm attracted to are different. And I don't model myself after financial professionals because it's just not what I'm drawn to.
That's just the kind of answer I expected from you, Patrick, to be honest. Patrick, we're coming to the end of our conversation, sadly. But I'd like to ask you, what is it? How can our listeners find you if they really want to engage with you? And what is it that you're working on that's really exciting at the moment?
Thank you. So my company is called Morrigan Strategic Advisors, which can be a little tricky to spell, but it's Morrigan is how you spell that first name. And so my website is morriganadvisors.com. I'm also findable on LinkedIn. I have a collaboration with a company called Partnernomics, which is an educational kind of an ed tech company out of Missouri that I work on on curriculum. So I'm teaching a strategic negotiations boot camp for teams through that company right now, and really just looking to meet people who are interested in getting better at negotiation. And so if you're curious, either just for a chat or you really want to engage with and develop those skills, I encourage anybody to reach out to me. I'm very open. I love connecting with people. So, please, any listeners who are curious should contact me for a conversation.
Superb. And Patrick's the one with the bow tie on his LinkedIn profile.
Well, I have one good picture that was taken of me over the last year or so I have to use it.
Patrick Griffin, thank you very much for joining us at Empathy at the Table. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's an honor, Tony. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye now.